we'll bring our committee to an open. Mr. Clerk, you want to read the roll?
Alderman Vaquero. Alderman Carter. Alderwoman Spencer.
Present.
Alderwoman Green.
Present.
Chairman French.
Present.
We have 4 present. We have a quorum.
All right. Today we are meeting with Professor David Klinger. Sure, thank you. Professor David Klinger from University of Missouri St. Louis. In the past, Dr. Klinger has prepared 2 reports, independent reviews of officer-involved shootings, an analysis of the St. Louis Police Department. The first one, dated August 2012, was for a period between 2008 and 2011. Actually, that was the second one, and then there was the first one was 2009, and it doesn't say when that period was. But with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Klinger, and if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself before we start.
Sure. I've been on the Criminology and Criminal Justice faculty at UMSL since 1999, and I teach a variety of courses there and do research because that's how UMSL is structured in terms of my workload. And one of the areas that I do a considerable amount of research on is policing, including use of force and deadly force by police officers. And I have published a book based upon a research study that I did where I interviewed police officers around the country. That was funded by the federal government, the study that led to the book. And I got some more federal funds to interview an additional 218 officers who've been involved in shootings, and am slowly but surely working my way towards a second book based upon that data. I testify as an expert witness in law enforcement related litigation, primarily use of force issues, and I also do training around the country on a variety of issues related to use of force, officer involved shootings. And what else would you like to know, sir?
Well, let's get into it. So, how did you come about preparing that first report back in 2009?
Right. I got a contract from the city to review the investigative case files of the...
Was that an RFP process, or did they contact you directly?
There was an RFP that was put out, and I submitted, and I don't know how many other submitted, but I was awarded the grant, for lack of a better term. And so I was hired to do basically what I would call a systematic review of the officer-involved shooting case files to understand what is going on in terms of officer-involved shootings in the city of St. Louis, as well as the investigative process afoot. One of the things that we know is that if we want to have sound oversight of the use of deadly force by police officers, we have to have sound investigative protocols in place. And unfortunately, sometimes there are liabilities or lack of precision, shall we say, in some officer-involved shooting investigations around the country. And so the City of St. Louis wanted for me to take an expert's eye to look at what's going on here, or what was going on here back in the first half of the first decade of the century, and also to review the policies. The officer-involved shootings are events that emanate for a variety of reasons, a variety of circumstances, but always governed by the police agency's shooting policy, use of force policy. And so I was asked to review that and compare it, contrast it to other policies around the country and model policies that have been offered by reputable police organizations. And so I did that, and then also to get a sense of the training that was going on at the time regarding the use of deadly force by police officers, and to talk with officers who've been involved in shootings to get a sense of their understanding of the policy, their appreciation of the training and the investigative process, so on and so forth. And so I submitted my proposal. It was funded. I reviewed the case files, met with training staff, met with command staff, rode along with officers, went out to the scenes of many shootings, talked to the involved officers, so I could get as well-rounded a sense as I could of what was going on with St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department in those areas that I described. And I basically did the same thing in the second report, but it was for a 4-year window as opposed to a 5-year window.
And so the period for the first report was what year, what year?
03 to 07, and then 08 through 2011 for the second one.
Okay.
So basically 9 years worth.
And are you currently working on a third report?
No, sir.
Okay. I believe that the police chief had told us that you were.
There may be some misapprehension or miscommunication rather, because what he might have been talking about was I had updated let me backtrack. I took a database that I developed for the first study, added all of the cases from 08 to 2011 to that database, and then I was given access to the officer-involved shooting case files from 2012. So I have a 10-year running cross-section of all officer-involved shootings involving St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department officers. And the document that I mentioned earlier that has been recently published, that was passed around, was based upon the entire 10-year window. So it may be that there's a bit of miscommunication, and what the chief was talking about was that I have updated through 2012 the investigative case files. I have that in my database, and a publication has been produced based upon that 10-year window. I can't say that for sure, but that's my best explanation. But I'm not currently under contract to do an additional review. And my logic is to wait for 2016 and then have another 5-year window, and then perhaps revisit the notion of taking a look at what has gone on since my previous report.
And that would require the police department to put out, or the city in this case now, to put out an RFP?
I believe so.
Okay. And so this third document that you've distributed to the committee here, this is an article for publication in some kind of a journal?
It's an academic journal, yes, sir.
Okay, and has this been published yet?
It was published this month, the February 2016 issue of the journal Criminology and Public Policy, yes, sir.
Okay. Are we free to make copies of this?
Absolutely, yes.
We put all our documents on our website, is that okay?
Sure. What I might recommend is, before we went on formal, I mentioned that I can get you access to the actual published version, which will have the appropriate pages of the journal. And if you prefer that, I can take someone's business card and email that to you probably tomorrow. And then you will have a PDF of the exact same document you're holding, except that it will have the proper pages in the journal noted, as opposed to pages 1 through whatever.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yes, sir.
I'll open it up to questions from the committee. Alderman Vaccaro?
I don't have any questions yet.
Okay.
Alderwoman Spencer?
Sure. So in a general sense, can you kind of help us understand how St. Louis use of force compares, nationally?
Unfortunately, I can't, and the reason I can't is the state of play in terms of what we know about the use of deadly force across the country is rudimentary at best.
Okay.
To make a very long story short, historically there has not been, sound, comprehensive data of officer-involved shootings across the country. The way that academics have been able to learn about deadly force is basically by the mechanism that I utilized for this publication along with my co-authors, which is get information from a single police department, dive into the case files, code it up, and then make a report. So there have been numerous city level studies over the years, but there's no comprehensive count. And because there's no comprehensive count, it's difficult to say that St. Louis is higher, lower, in between, that their policies are more restrictive, less restrictive, that St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department officers fire more rounds, fewer rounds, whatever the case might be. I hate to give you that answer, but that's the way it is. If you want more information, I can explain to you why the data that exists is lousy and why we can't move forward with any sort of sound comparison, but I prefer to stop here and wait for your next question.
Sure. So along the same lines, can you help me better understand what so you mentioned that hopefully, or your idea would be that in 2017, I assume you mean,
Right.
there would be another 5-year window
Right.
that you could get that data, and then
Right.
presumably the city of St. Louis would issue an RFP so that you could respond and do another 5-year study. Do other cities or what does the frequency funding look like compared to, I understand the problem probably still exists to be able to compare, but
Right.
can you help us understand back in 2009 when you started this, if St. Louis was at the forefront of this type of research or investigation, or if we're lacking, or what we should be doing as a city to better understand where we are, even if we can't compare it nationally?
I would argue that St. Louis is way ahead of the curve. And the reason I argue that is that there have been a few times that I'm aware of where major cities have reached out to an outsider or put out an RFP, whatever the case might be, and said, please come take a look at our practices, please come take a look at our case files, and let us know what you think. But it is certainly not standard. The Metropolitan Police, Metro-Dade Police Department, or the Miami-Dade Police Department, has recently put out an RFP, for example, to do what I essentially have done. They put it out sometime in late 2015, and there's an example of an agency realizing we should have an outside look, but St. Louis was years and years ahead of that. Dallas asked for one from another expert years ago, but it is certainly not typical for law enforcement agencies to seek, or cities to seek, outside expertise to come and assess their use of deadly force.
Okay. And what other, can you kind of give us, you mentioned 2 cities, but what other cities are, again, at the forefront, what we should be doing that we're not doing as far as facilitating that type of research?
One of the things, this is going to be a little bit off the beaten path, but I think it addresses your question. If not, I'll circle back with your direction. But what some agencies have been doing for several years now is posting their officer-involved shooting information on their website. And that's one of the things that I mentioned in at least my second report, is that after the officer-involved shooting internal affairs review has been completed, that the abstracted results, shall we say, of that be posted on the website so that all citizens who are interested can go ahead and take a look. Los Angeles has done that for several years now. I think Dallas just moved to that. Some other agencies I know do that. So there are some ways that other agencies are getting information out there, but so far as, once again, doing the deep dive into the information that is existing in terms of training files, training practices, case file investigations, it is my belief that St. Louis, with these 2 efforts, is certainly at the leading edge, and has been at the leading edge now for years.
The leading edge of research.
The leading edge of having outsiders who have some expertise come in and make assessments, not just in terms of, oh, your policy is okay, oh, your training is okay, but really getting into the guts of what goes on. Oftentimes, in many aspects of human endeavors completely outside of law enforcement, there's going to be a gap between what goes on and the line and what the staff says about what's going on. So you can have really nice policies, but if they're not being followed, or people don't understand. One of the things I noted in the first report in particular was that many officers really didn't have a good understanding of what that policy said.
Many officers did not have
did not have a sound understanding that I interviewed. Many of those officers didn't have a sound understanding of what the policy regarding the use of deadly force said. And so getting into the guts of what is actually going on by talking to the officers about their understandings, by talking to about policy and training, talking to officers about what they experienced when they were involved in shootings, and really getting a ground level sense through that, and seeing what goes on in terms of how many shots are fired, who's shooting, circumstances they're shooting under, so on and so forth. It's difficult to really know what's going on in an agency, because if you just look at what the policy says and what the policy makers and command staff say, you're really missing what's going on. And as I said, that's not just about law enforcement, it's about anything. There's been a number of sociological studies that talk about the gap between staff and line work.
Can we talk about the policy?
Sure.
And
Sure.
your, so how our use of force policy compares, across the country?
Right. I haven't seen the latest policy, so I'm going to be talking about the policies that I reviewed. And the St. Louis Police Department policy, as I understood it during these 2 reviews, basically is consistent with what the national standards are regarding the use of deadly force. That is that police officers are permitted to use deadly force to protect themselves or another innocent third party, that would be another police officer or a citizen, from attacks that are reasonably perceived to be likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. We call that basically the defense of life standard. And then also under Tennessee versus Garner, which is a 1989 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, police officers are also permitted to use deadly force to stop the flight of violent felons. I'll just leave it at that for this purpose. If you want to get deeper into it, we can certainly talk about that. And the St. Louis Police Department policy also permits that. There are some language issues that I had with some of the ways that the policy frames certain things about shooting at fleeing felons. But basically, the policies that I read were consistent with the national standards, consistent with what the Constitution says, and indeed are more restrictive than what Missouri state law says about the use of deadly force. There are some quibbles I have in terms of warning shots and shooting at and from moving vehicles, and we could certainly get into detail if someone has a copy of the current policy, because I think that's the thing we'd want to be talking about.
It's on the website, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I was curious if, along that, like why, maybe you haven't, let's take a step. How often does our use of force policy, change or be altered?
You'd have
do
to
you know?
talk to your
Police chief?
to police chief. Yeah.
Okay, and is there, can you help me better understand maybe why, are you looking into this on a very regular basis?
No.
Okay.
No.
I don't want to pin you up and
Yeah.
say, why haven't you looked at the news, police forum? But that's kind of what I'm wondering, but if that's not something that you.
If I were doing a study of shooting policies across the country, or I had some compelling reason to be monitoring what St. Louis Police Department was doing in terms of policy statements, I'd look at that stuff.
Mhm.
But that's not something that I'm doing research on, and I don't
Okay.
have any contract for me to assess this.
Okay.
So,
Mr. Chairman, I'll defer to you on this because it would be my inclination to kind of, pick up the doctor's brain on how our police force, use of force policy could be bettered, or what problems might be in it, but I'm not sure what direction you'd like the hearing to, this meeting to go in today. And so-
ask
But we don't have the copy of the.
Would you like to get the current,
what I would prefer on that, because
Sure,
I
and
thought.
it would be new for you, I wouldn't want to.
Exactly. I thought we were gonna talk about this body of research. I didn't even know it
Sure,
was
sure.
about this stuff. But I would be more than willing to come back at another time, sometime in March or April, or whenever time be available, and give me some time to review it. Then what I could do is I could say, look, here's the policy that I see currently. Here's what the ICP is saying. International Association of Chiefs of Police is saying. Here's what the Police Executive Research Forum has currently said. I don't know if you're aware of it.
Mhm.
Okay, you are aware of that. So there's some, let us say, some contentious discussion
Mhm.
about some issues about how force policy should be crafted, what officers should be trained about, and I would feel comfortable only if I could review the document and we could have some prep time, and then we could have an informed discussion.
I think that sounds like a good, I would like to do that. I think that one of the things we should maybe want to come out of this would be, recommendations or of.
I don't think it's not to kick in, but we have to have the thing before the end of the session.
Sure.
So,
When is this end of the session, sir?
April the 17th is signing day, so we would have to have met and had a letter submitted with our recommendations. before.
Right, so the purpose of this subcommittee is to make recommendations to the full board. We, at the last meeting, voted to ask the chairman of public safety, who created the subcommittee, to authorize additional time. He did do that, so we are now authorized through the end of session, which gives us an additional month and a half, actually. So we would have time to call. It might mean meeting in the break.
That's fine, but he was saying April or May, it was kind of.
No, I was simply saying
You know,
that,
I mean, if, so first, on our, the subcommittee has created a website, useofforcepolicy.org. All the documents that we've obtained from the police department are available. That includes all the recent documents related to use of force policy.
Okay,
So perhaps you will have an opportunity to review that over the next week or so.
sure.
And maybe we can schedule another committee hearing next week. And I think what Alderwoman Spencer is really hinting at is that you could be a very valuable source in helping us prepare our document. And just reviewing your two previous documents, there are some recommendations in there.
Right.
And I was gonna ask you a few questions about that.
Sure.
But Alderwoman Spencer, please continue your questions, or if not, we'll.
Sure, I guess what I would, could you highlight for us some of the major recommendations? There's a lot of documents here, and maybe from your perspective, what you think what you'd like to highlight?
From my old stuff?
Well, I haven't had a chance to look at your new,
Right.
the one you brought today
The
much,
new
so-
report says
sure.
absolutely nothing about use of force policies. It's an academic
Okay,
assessment of spatial determinants of officer-involved shootings. Don't want to get too esoteric, but
sure,
long story short, neighborhood context, and we find X, Y, and Z. Nothing to do with policy.
okay. So kind of putting them all together, what would you say, what would your recommendations be? Can you kind of help us summarize, top?
I would like to see what the current policy is, if we're just talking about policy, or are you talking about more generally, in terms of my recommendations?
I'm speaking more generally as far
Okay.
as your recommendations,
Got
yeah.
it. I think the most important thing that has been done is that the force investigation unit has been stood up in the city in terms of having a dedicated group investigate officer-involved shootings. And it is my understanding at this point that they investigate only situations where suspects are struck by gunfire. It may be a wise idea to have them investigate all shootings, whether a suspect is struck or not, so that what we get, or what you get, what the city gets, what the police department gets, is a uniform level of investigative expertise. So that might be one thing to consider, but I was.
And, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
you're speaking of like anytime a police officer's gun is discharged?
Right. When I say officer-involved shooting, what I mean is a situation where an officer intentionally discharges his or her firearm, either in the line of duty or off-duty, taking a police action. So obviously, we're not going to study,
Sure,
the guy's hunting, the gal is at the target range, whatever the case might be. But that's an intentional situation where an officer discharges his or her firearm. Whether a hit is whether any bullets strike a suspect or not. I don't believe we need to have officer-involved shooting team roll out when animals are shot, when there's an accidental discharge, when nobody is struck. But if there's an accidental discharge where someone is struck, I think it makes sense to have the shooting team, I'll just call them the shooting team for lack of a better term right now, come out and investigate that. Unfortunately, you need to have the same level of expertise to document everything when there's an accidental discharge when someone is struck, just like you have a purposeful discharge if someone is struck. But anyway, so I think that the standing up the shooting team was a very good idea. I think it lends a level of expertise to the process and increases the credibility of the investigative process. The general notion of training, I mentioned in the second report, there was an increase in force-on-force training. And force-on-force training basically is real-life simulation with firearms that fire what we call marking cartridges. And what this does is this allows police officers not merely to stand in front of a static target and qualify, but to actually have to make decisions about whether to use their weapon or not. And equally importantly in my mind, they have to move in whatever the training environment is so that their tactics can be assessed by the trainers. One of the things I stress in the report is that research indicates that some number, we don't know how big, what percent of the pie it might be, but some number of situations where officers discharge their weapons could have been prevented through the use of sound appropriate tactics. Something as simple as, if you're here by yourself, you're having a mental crisis and you've got a gun, we all flee. Well, why would a police officer step into this room and confront you and then they might shoot you? Instead, you lock it down, we can call the crisis negotiators and have a discussion, and they talk you down, to use police parlance. But unfortunately, sometimes officers do rush in to situations where they could use verbal tactics to diffuse it. So force on force training, what happens is you can put an officer in a situation, a scenario such as that. A radio call comes out. We have a despondent member of the Board of Aldermen who is it's a mock setup, obviously, who is in the hearing chamber.
It happens every Friday.
Okay. Just on Fridays, I'll be sure not to come.
No one's armed,
Fridays.
no.
No one's armed, but there's usually despondency.
And she is holding herself hostage in essence. She's chased everybody out. What are you gonna do? Well, if the officer steps in and shoots because you point a gun, well, legally, okay, you pointed a gun, officer has a right to go home, officer has a right to defend his or her life. But why in the world, the training critique is gonna be, why in the world did you go in the first place? And so we can place officers in situations in force on force where they have to make not just choices about using deadly force, but choices about tactics, calling for backup, getting supervisors on scene, whatever the case might be. So the improvement in the level of force on force training is positive, and without knowing how many hours officers go through this now, I don't know, but the more you can do, the better, period, paragraph, end of story. So that is a recommendation that I would put forward. Now, it may be that in terms of budgets and so on and so forth, that the city police department is training at the absolute top level. I don't know, but you can never get enough training. Let's see, other recommendations. One of the things that I did talk about in the report, and this is related to the issue of the policy, and I talked about shooting fleeing felons. There seems to be a belief, at least years ago, when I was doing the second study, that the officers felt they wouldn't be supported if they used their firearm in conformance with the policy regarding shooting fleeing felons. And this is a proposition that is debatable in the sense that I don't think anybody in their right mind says police officers don't have a right to use deadly force to protect themselves or innocent third parties from serious bodily injury or death. But the notion of shooting fleeing felons is one that many people say, why is it that you would ever shoot a fleeing felon? Let's have a pure defensive life standard. And that defensive life standard is right now at the moment a life is in jeopardy. The way that I think about it, and I didn't point this out early on when the alderman who's chairing this asked me a quick biographical sketch. I was a police officer for 3.5 years. And one of the things that, from having worked the streets and thinking about it for the last 35 years, the primary job of the police is to protect innocent life. And when you have a violent felon who a police officer has probable cause to believe has committed a violent felony, and they are armed with a deadly weapon, and they either threaten the officer or their flight will permit them to escape, the general public is in danger. And so I believe that officers should have the sense that if they shoot a violent felon who is fleeing their attempt to arrest them, that they should have no doubt that there will be support from the police department, from the mayor's office, all the way up and down the chain. Because what's going to happen is if you don't have officers believing that, officers will let violent felons escape who will then go on and commit other violent acts. And so I would recommend that the training does two things. Number one, tells police officers with no uncertainty, you must have probable cause to believe that a violent crime has been committed. You cannot have just an inkling. You cannot just have some gut sense. But if you have probable cause to believe a violent crime has occurred, then officer-involved shooting is permissible. But they really have to understand that and then be told, if you have this, you are operating within the four corners of our policy, you are operating within the four corners of the Constitution, and that is an appropriate, legally permissible use of deadly force, and one that we will support you on, because innocent life has to take precedence over the life of the criminal suspect. And this goes back to a long-standing tradition in American law enforcement about the prioritization of life. And so anytime there's a situation where deadly force is going to be on the table, in terms of police officer perhaps using deadly force, have to think about the prioritization of life, which is at the top, innocent citizens, then police, and then the criminal suspect. And so what happens if you have a situation where violent suspects are free to flee, you invert that and you place the life of the criminal above the life of the innocent public. So for example, if I am a police officer chasing someone down an alley, and I happen to know that at the mouth of the alley, it's gonna be a T alley, and if they go to the left, there is a preschool. In my opinion, the life of those preschoolers and the staff and the teachers is more valuable than the life of the criminal suspect when you have probable cause to believe that a violent crime has occurred. So if I'm chasing someone, they've got a gun in their hand, they just shot somebody, I'm not gonna let them get access to, the criminal get access to this, what we call a victim pool. Use of deadly force is appropriate. But officers that I spoke with were very wary whether the police department and the city writ large would support them were they to shoot a violent felon. So there is something that I think training and not just about the policy, but also with the assurance that if you execute the policy within the four corners of the policy, that you will be supported would be positive. So, and I wrote about that in my reports in terms of saying I understand that this is a contentious topic, but because I believe that the prioritization of life should place innocence over criminal suspects, that is the correct way to go.
And so to reiterate a point that you made earlier,
Yeah.
it sounds like there's not a firm understanding on the police force of the
Correct.
actual use of force policy. Did you
Correct.
look into whether or not officers in general have a good understanding of other policies?
In terms
Other
of.
other policing policies? I mean, is it a misunderstanding, or is it a lack of firm understanding of policies across the board, or just when it comes to the use of force policy?
I only talked to them about the use of deadly force. That's the
Okay.
only issue I raised. And it wasn't a systematic study, and one of the things I mentioned in the report is that it wasn't a systematic study. It was
Sure.
simply an impressionistic one by talking with the officers who've been involved in shootings. We could certainly put together a more comprehensive, robust, scientifically valid study that would query all officers about not just the use of deadly force policy, but other policies, and see how well their comprehension corresponds to the statements in the policy.
Great. And then just, you mentioned that you served as an officer for 3.5
Right.
years. Can you tell us where you served?
I worked for the city of Los Angeles, where I went through my basic academy training and worked 3 patrol areas, 77th Street precinct or division, excuse me, Pacific and Hollywood, high crime, high activity levels. And then after a couple of years, I went to work for the city of Redmond, which is a small suburb outside of Seattle. Now it's world famous because of Microsoft, but back then it was literally a cow town. We would hear calls periodically about cows wandering the streets, so on and so forth. So my experience spans very high crime, violent inner city areas to more remote, semi-rural areas.
Okay, thank you for being here today. Thank
Sure.
you for your, for sharing your time with us, obviously, and I think that's all the questions I have at this moment.
Alderwoman Green?
Thanks.
Yes.
So I have a couple of questions, I think, regarding use of force when somebody does not have a gun.
Okay.
If they have, in the case of Kajimi Powell
Mhm.
here in the city, he had a
Mhm.
knife instead
Right.
of a gun. And so is there a different standard, or how does the thought process change?
The standard is the same standard whether there is no weapon, a blunt weapon, an edged weapon, an automobile, a firearm, a bomb, whatever the case might be. Is there what we call in police circles an imminent threat of death or great bodily injury? And so if we think about it, someone can kill you with a gun, someone can kill you with a knife, someone can kill you with a car, someone can kill you with a bomb, someone can kill you with their bare hands. And if we look at the uniform crime reports the FBI puts out on their homicide tables, they report that hundreds and hundreds of people are murdered each year with what they call personal weapons, fists and feet, elbows, headbutts, whatever. And so the issue of the knife is, versus the gun, is distance. very simply, if I have a gun, I can be right here and I could harm each of you very seriously. If I have only a knife, I might be able to get at you, but you'd have to hold your arm out before I could slash you. So you have distance as a mechanism to protect yourself. And so what police officers are trained and should be trained about, we call them edge weapons, knife attacks is a category of an edge weapon, is that if you have distance and there is no attack, the person is merely standing there, then there is no threat. And you can stand there and you can talk. You have your gun out. You let the person know that they need to keep their distance, whatever the case might be. There's a set of verbal tactics I won't get into in detail that can be used. Time is on your side. Try to call for less lethal munitions to be brought on board or to be brought to the location so that we could use impact munitions, which are a type of specialty weapon that comes out of either a shotgun or a gas launcher. Don't know how much into the weeds you want to get. But the point is, when you've got a knife, you can generally talk for a while. So you take the situation that you mentioned, where there was a knife in the suspect's hand and he aggressively moved towards the officers. In that situation, the officers are stationary and you have an armed suspect who is moving towards you with that weapon. At some point, your life becomes, your life is placed in jeopardy. And different people will make different arguments about what the distance might be. The general rule of thumb has been basically 7 yards or 21 feet. Why is that basic rule of thumb 7 yards, 21 feet? Where did it come from? A gentleman by the name of Troller, I can't remember how to spell his name, did some time and motion and distance studies and said that if you have your firearm holstered and someone is 21 feet away from you with an armed with a weapon, edge weapon, they can close that gap and stab you before you can draw your gun and get a round off. Well, some people have turned that into the 21-foot rule, but it really isn't a rule that says if someone's within 21 feet with a knife, you need to shoot them. It's the issue of if someone is attacking you and they cross that threshold of about 7 yards, we know three things. Number one, we know that human beings take some time to process information. And so between the time that someone starts attacking you and the time that you, even if you have your gun out, the time you can bring your gun to bear and pull the trigger, that's going to take some tenths of a second. The second thing is firearm accuracy. We know from my study and reams of other studies that unfortunately, for whatever reason, most police bullets don't strike the intended target. That is, they don't strike the suspect that the officer is shooting at. And then the third thing is something called terminal ballistics or wound ballistics. And that is the science of bullets in the human body. And what we know is that because it takes tenths of a second to execute the decision to fire, pull the trigger, that many bullets miss, and that even when bullets strike, they don't immediately incapacitate. Officers are trained that if someone is attacking you within that threshold of about 20 feet or so, that deadly force is an appropriate response. Did that get to your?
It did. I guess my question is, looking at the video.
Right.
It was 11 seconds of pulling up, probably in my mind closer than maybe they should have been. It didn't give the opportunity to, like you were saying, kind of talk and diffuse the situation. And so what happens, I guess, when you in hindsight, you look at one of those videos and you say, they pulled up way too close. And
I would disagree.
There wasn't, you think that, okay.
The call, as I understand it, didn't go out, male mental subject armed with a knife. As I understand it, the call went out something regarding someone who had stolen something. And so those police officers actually were parked well away, well further away than the 21 feet between where the suspect or subject was and where the front of their vehicle was. And so I have no criticism of that. And the other thing is, even had they had the call of an individual armed with a knife, remember the prioritization of life that I mentioned. If I'm a police officer and I am not willing to try to get close enough to what we call hailing distance to be able to talk to the person, I'm going to keep 100 feet away. I've got someone with a knife and all of those citizens are in jeopardy. And so these are the sorts of things that police officers have to think about. If it's an isolated individual in an alley and there's nobody around, police officers can take more distance and deploy at more distance than a situation where you have citizens around.
So then the other question I have
Right.
is, recently I've watched and been doing a lot of reading about what they do in the UK. So
Mhm.
as you know, in the UK, officers are not armed,
Right.
but they do have a pretty fair incidence of people with knives. And there's a lot of reading and videos and things like that that you can watch and how they de-escalate those situations without use of deadly use of force.
Mhm.
Are there things that we can be incorporating or learning from places like that to when somebody doesn't have a gun to be able to
Certainly,
spare life?
if there are particular tactics that can be put in place to resolve a situation when there is no knife attack, absolutely. And I think there's a big difference between dealing with someone with a knife and someone attacking. And I have seen the video that came out on YouTube right away and got a lot of press play. But if you look at, it was Kajemi Powell, was that his name? If you look at Mr. Powell, what he does, in my mind, as I'm looking at this, he takes the high ground. He goes up onto that elevated platform of that other parking lot. The only reason you do that is because you want to attack. Anyone who knows anything about the military, anyone who knows anything about fighting knows that you're at an advantage when you are up higher. And so I'm looking at this and I'm saying he's attacking the officers with a knife. And having been involved in situations where individuals have attacked police officers with knives and having seen it with my own eyes, that was a life-threatening situation. And about the only way that that could have been resolved differently was had the officers known that there was an individual with a knife there. Had they had less lethal munitions, perhaps one of the officers, the passenger officer ideally, could have immediately deployed with a beanbag shotgun and attempted to strike Mr. Powell with the beanbag shotgun as a mechanism to stop him. But save that, it happened so quickly. You pointed out about 11 seconds or so. From the time Mr. Powell moves aggressively towards the police officers, the officers are giving verbal commands, he disobeys the verbal commands, and they start shooting. And we all wish that it hadn't happened that way, but I really don't see that the officers had any other choice.
So then the other question is, Kajimi Powell also had a history of mental illness, and we're seeing that nationally there's a disproportionate
Yep.
number of people with mental illness who are falling victim to
Right.
police deadly use of force. So what can we be doing differently to combat that?
I think there's two things. The first thing is we have to understand, or I'm going to answer in two parts. The first thing is we have to understand that sometimes people in mental crisis are engaged in forms of behavior that threaten innocent citizens or threaten police officers, and there's really nothing else that you can do. It's unfortunate, but if someone is committed for whatever reason in their mentally disturbed situation, they are attacking, they are seeking to harm, there's really nothing that the police can do. But those situations where there is no attack, those situations where it's static, or those situations where police have been able to set up a cordon, shall we say, those are times when negotiating skills are necessary. And they need to be trained from the ground up. And what I mean by that is line officers need to understand the difference between someone who's apparently, we never know for sure, but apparently mentally impaired, emotionally disturbed, whatever term of art we wish to use, and people who are criminals. And so, for example, in a situation where you have an individual who is, the only information you have is this person is a hardened criminal, this person is a robber. They have a knife, they've said, I'm not gonna be taken alive, they are presenting a threat, they're starting to attack. Really, that is one set of verbal commands you use. Drop it, this, that, and the other thing. Very firm because you're dealing with a rational actor. And we know that when you place many rational actors with the threat of, if you don't stop this, you will die, many rational actors will cease, okay? But when you're dealing with someone who's mentally or emotionally disturbed, you have to take another tack. And the tack there is to try to, if you can, create some sense of affiliation, some sense of recognition, some sense of we're both human beings, we're in this together, and that's when you get to de-escalate. So, for example, in a situation where you are a police officer, you see somebody who is behaving in a, shall we say, non-traditional fashion, indicating they're emotionally disturbed. We don't know, are they high on something, do they have a diagnosis, whatever the case might be. Drop the knife, drop the knife. Well, after 2 or 3 drop the knives, it's not working. Sir, we're here to help, but that knife that you're holding is presenting a threat. You need to put that knife down. Can we talk about this? Whatever. Go ahead and calm it down. But the police officer still has to understand that if that doesn't work and that person becomes aggressive, either towards a citizen or towards the officer, then the officer may have to use deadly force. So at any rate, train officers about the distinction between the individual who's the criminal and the individual who is emotionally disturbed. We'll just use that term of art for now. So line officers will get in the habit of being able to, for lack of a better term, flip a switch that says, oh, this person's not a crook, this person is mentally disturbed or emotionally disturbed. Here's the protocol we use in terms of verbal tactics. That's the line officer or officers on the ground. Then, in terms of crisis intervention team management, maybe supervisors, maybe getting some sort of crisis negotiators who are even trained above that, maybe your hostage negotiators, so on and so forth. Get them on scene to try to reduce things and calm things down further. That's all good, but you're also going to have to train officers about how to set up a cordon, about how to protect innocents, evacuate the innocents, so on and so forth. So it's much more complex than merely teaching line officers using different verbal tactics than you would against a criminal. But yes, there are things that can be done, and it needs to be an integrated process where up and down the chain of command, officers, St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department have the training and have the understanding to be able to make educated guesses about what they're dealing with. That is it a criminal incident or an emotionally disturbed incident, and then use the appropriate level of force, use the appropriate tactics, get the appropriate support there, so on and so forth. But so it's more complicated than merely saying officers need to be trained to de-escalate. What that de-escalation training is about is very important. And oh, by the way, you also should think about how to de-escalate criminal situations. And you have to be able to apply the correct verbal tactics and the correct tactical model. One of the things, I don't know if this is part of what you're getting at or not, are you talking about the San Francisco situation where a guy had a knife and 5 officers shot him? Are you aware of that? Okay. One of the things that officers definitely need to be trained in is what we call fire control. I don't know all the details about the San Francisco incident. I've only seen the video, but for 5 police officers to shoot in that situation is just wrong. We have known for years in law enforcement that once you have the situation, it's not static, it's still dynamic, but once it has been cordoned off so that you can protect innocents and you've got multiple officers there, you have a perimeter, for lack of a better term, we designate officers. So if all of you 5 people are the officers who show up and I'm the supervisor, I am Sergeant Klinger and you are the officers, and I see that all 5 of you have your guns out and you're all screaming at this person who's in the corner with a knife, I'm immediately going to take charge and I'm immediately going to say, you 2 are my designated cover officers. Another term of art is designated shooters. You other 3, put your guns away. Why? We don't all need to shoot. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to say, French, I got it right? Good.
You got it.
French, you're the talker.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody else shut up. So you don't have 5 guys yelling and screaming, and here's this individual who's in a mental crisis, and 5 people are screaming at him, and you're saying, drop the knife, you're saying,
Be quiet.
be quiet, whatever the case might be, and this person is confused. So we have linear communication involved. We have a situation now where we have designated shooters, designated cover officers, and one of the things that we avoid in that situation, even though I'm not a big fan of the notion, but I know it has happened, contagious fire or sympathetic fire. Sometimes one officer will shoot, and most of the time officers are squared away, but sometimes if you shoot, the other officers shoot. That doesn't happen when we've got designated shooters or designated cover officers. So things like that have been around in law enforcement for literally 40 years are things that need to be incorporated in the quote-unquote de-escalation training.
So then one last question,
Yep.
you know, kind of going back to Kichimi Powell.
Yep.
I thought that it was, that when the 911 call was made, that the person on the phone, and I could be wrong, said that they thought that the person was having a mental issue.
I would have to
And
go,
would
you know, it's
that-
been a year and a half.
If,
But anyway, go ahead.
if that was the case, if, you know, a 911 caller or whatever said this person, you know, maybe took something, but they seem to be mentally unstable,
Mm-hmm.
does that change the way that the officers would then go into the situation?
Yes and no, because as I indicated, these officers stayed well further away than 21 feet. They were back, I can't remember now, 40-some feet. And so it changes in terms of the mindset about maybe the verbal tactics that are going to be used, but in terms of the placement of the vehicle, no, because once again, if I've got a mentally disturbed individual with a knife and there are innocent citizens there, I have an obligation to protect them. And that obligation, like I said, with this prioritization of life, is higher than my obligation to protect myself. If all I'm interested in is protecting myself as a police officer, I never leave police headquarters. I never leave the district station. I never do anything. So what we have to do is we have to get officers deployed in the field so they can assess the situation and move forward from there. And so I have no criticism whatsoever of these officers in terms of the distance of the deployment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's my final question. Thanks.
Mhm.
All right, did you have another question?
No, my son's an officer, so I guess I have a different view. And of course, I look like Norvell Brown, who was a young police officer and was patrolling in the area that he grew up in. He felt that he could talk to the guys, and of course, they shot and killed him.
Right.
So, you know, I also, you know, have that, you know, as a parent thing going
Right.
on too, you know, that, so I probably view things differently than maybe other people would view something. I agree with almost everything you were saying about that, you know, and one of the things that I probably got out of this, and I don't know how possible or impossible, but maybe they should carry something that shoots a beanbag kind of thing, that maybe in a situation like that could have been used, I don't know, but I also agree that if I'm about as close as we are and I got a knife,
Right.
and I look like, you know, I'm coming, you know, I guess I would, you know, I would have fear of that. Now, myself personally, I'm not a police officer, I would run, but it probably, you know, wouldn't be appropriate for them to run.
No, and there's actually videotapes of police officers who are being attacked with knives who run and fall.
Well, and then I also have a son that's a firefighter, paramedic. And he's got the Medal of Valor because he stayed in a building that was, while he was trying to keep a lady and a husband and wife alive while they were bringing them out of the building, he stayed as the building, you know. So, I mean, they're trained, police officers as well as firefighters are trained to go into those situations. And
Right.
I don't know if the adrenaline, again, if there's a building on fire, the last place I'm at is outside the building. The firefighters refer that to, they don't wanna be outstanding firemen, outstanding on the lawn while everybody else is in there fighting the fire,
Right.
so. I mean, I just know having those in my family, and of course, you know, from Officer Stanzi to Norvell Brown to the different officers we did fundraisers for, you know, I just, you know, I get that. I also understand that my neighbor was involved and got let go from the police department because they were shot into a car, you know. And I understand after reading this, you're not supposed to put yourself in a situation where the car could be used against you or put yourself. So, anyway, I'm just, you know, and I appreciate being put on this because I do have a different thought process. And but anyway, one thing I thought maybe could come out of this is how hard would it be to actually have a weapon that would fire a beanbag in the cars? Because in a situation like that, could they have used that? Well, we know a taser wouldn't work with a coat on. You know, the odds of a taser working and getting close enough to use a taser, that it's not gonna make contact with the skin, but I think a beanbag thing might actually, or something like that might actually be a thought. But anyway, I just was, when you said that, I never thought about that, but.
No, there's some interesting technologies out there, and maybe they'll come up with something better. But for my money, impact munitions, 12-gauge beanbags, rounds fired from a standard shotgun that you dedicate only for beanbags, and you paint them orange or green or pink or yellow, whatever, so there can be no mistake about what type of munition you have, because we had situations when beanbags were first rolled out as an alternative to using impact munitions, or using impact weapons and having to get close. There were a series of situations where officers thought they were firing a beanbag and it was a regular lethal round and they killed people. So you have to have a dedicated firearm for that. And you also have to have 2 officers.
That's what I was gonna say.
Right.
You have to have.
Right.
Because if there's one, you're not gonna grab a beanbag gun, just.
Right.
But if there's 2 officers in the car, if one
Right.
has his regular gun, the other one.
Right. Or if you and I are on patrol and we are in border sectors and we both respond to the call, and let's say the call comes out as the Alderwoman mentioned, of a despondent individual with a knife, and that's all we know, and we get to the situation as we're there. I'm communicating with you. Okay, you're gonna be beanbagged. You go, Roger that. We get there. We see the suspect 50 feet away, 80 feet away, whatever the case might be. You could deploy, at least theoretically, with that shotgun beanbag. I could have either a rifle or the pistol, and perhaps we could use that. You could use that as a mechanism to take the individual into custody. And this notion of what we call lethal overwatch, when you have less lethal weapons involved, is a standard practice in law enforcement. But when you are working independently, getting that coordination is not as easy as it might sound.
Okay, thank you.
Alderwoman Spencer, do you have a
I did have a
follow-up
couple of follow-up questions.
Yes,
So,
ma'am.
something that was kind of mentioned by Alderwoman Green, the phone call regarding, getting the information, whether or not the suspect had a knife.
Right.
Do you feel like there is a disconnect between, so we've had some criticisms of our 911, call, the dispatchers. And do you feel like is there an issue there with transmitting correct information that can contribute to officers maybe using force when it may not be necessary? I'm not talking about that specific case you were
Right.
speaking about earlier, but do you feel like this is a contributing factor?
Certainly, and actually James, I believe his name is pronounced Gillinson, at SLU, wrote a piece that was published in a journal called Criminology maybe 20 years ago, called They Is Clowning Tough, talking about how it is that the 911 operators have to translate the information that comes from a citizen into cop speak, and how there can be miscommunications. And then one of the things that I wrote in 1997, a piece in the journal called Criminology, Klinger and Bridges, Measurement Error and Calls for Service, is that there is a notable disconnect between what a citizen says and what comes out in terms of a broadcast, because the dispatcher has to translate that, and also citizens often don't know what information they've got. So they say it's a burglar when it's a robber. They say it's a burglar when it's a prowler. They say it's a robber when it's someone who committed a theft, so on and so forth. So that lack of correspondence between what is happening on the ground and what the police officer is told is always problematic. And so police officers can't put 100% stake in anything they get. But officers nonetheless have to respond to whatever it is they're dispatched to. So yes, training dispatchers, training the people, training the call takers, training the dispatchers, and training the officers, so that everybody is on the same page about what may be going on. Don't get locked into a reified definition of the situation based upon a radio broadcast. That's important. Did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay.
Yes. And then-
Just having a daughter that's supervisor up there at dispatch, and having sit in up there, so when you call in, it's an evaluator, it's not the dispatcher that answers.
Mhm.
while you're talking to them on the phone, they're typing something that's going to a dispatcher, and in a lot of cases, and they have, the dispatcher has to, like triage that call.
Mhm.
So if they're typing active shooter at this address while the person's on the phone, well, hey, some guy's shooting at us and stuff like that, they're not gonna type in, hey, some guy's shooting at us, but they are gonna put there's an active shooter at whatever. They're typing it in while you're still talking to them. It goes to the dispatcher's active shooter at this address. They're gonna get, that dispatcher's gonna put that ahead of, you know, a
Sure.
burglary, or put that ahead of, you know, stat calls. But they're not, I mean, I don't know how, you know, and maybe we should all go sit up there sometime, but I don't know how much time they have in the case of something where, you know, people are on the phone screaming stuff,
Mhm.
that, you know, they're trying to get to it as quick as they can.
Sure.
I don't know that they have time to say, well, is the guy mentally stable? Does he have a gun? Has he ever done anything before? Is this the
Sure.
first time that happened?
But
It's
some
just-
of those questions are important, and I think, you know, to Dr. Klinger's point, translating them to cop speak, so to speak, or, you know, some translatable, you know, the mindset of an officer who's gonna be responding may be something worth kind of looking into. In your first report that we had access to here from 2009, it was stated, and I already lost the page, but that officers were involved in investigating the discharge of their own weapons in
Yep.
cases where citizens were not,
Right.
and that furthermore, line officers responding to an incident were involved in investigating issues where suspects were shot, and that this is an egregious practice that, in your words, needed to be terminated immediately. That was from 2009. Is that still occurring? Do you know, within the police department?
My understanding is that anytime there's a hit, the shooting team rolls out, and when it's a non-hit, detectives who are either district detectives, that's my understanding, or some other specially trained officers, detectives, go out and do the investigation. So it is my understanding that that practice of having line officers investigate other line officers no longer happens.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. And if that's not the case, then you guys should take the police department to the woodshed.
Sure. Well, we should maybe find out from the chief what the protocol
Yeah.
exactly
That
is,
is.
and what, I'm
I
sorry?
can tell you that is the case.
That is the case, yeah.
Because
Yeah, and just make sure that it's.
My son's a homicide detective.
Sure.
But if a police officer shoots someone
Mhm.
and that person, for whatever reason, the homicide detectives were taken out.
Sure.
They don't investigate it. They used to, but I think it was like last year
Yeah.
that
They changed.
switched. But I do know that just from my son that they don't do that.
And I think a separate instance, which was mentioned in your report, would be discharge of a firearm that resulted in nobody being hit.
Right.
But potentially that discharging officer, weapon discharging officer, could potentially be investigating that instance. And maybe we should just clarify with the chief if that ever, you know, if, what the policies, I'm kind of taking notes, but then.
Let's hope that's not the
Let's
policy
hope that's
now.
not
Yeah.
the policy anymore. Then a couple of other things. One thing that was recommended, that's not maybe currently part of protocol, would be that officers not in uniform self-identify as an
Mhm.
officer to anybody, and that is, do you know if that policy, and again, these are old reports, so
Right.
perhaps there's been some change. Do you know if that's still not part of protocol?
I do not know, I'll have to look at the
Okay,
report,
sure,
I mean,
sure,
look
sure.
at the policy, and we have that
Sure, sure,
discussion
sure.
next week or whenever.
Yeah, okay, but that's something I hadn't realized was an
Mhm.
issue. And then, can you talk about, the need, for, or your recommendation for firearms qualifications, increasing from 2 times a year to 4 times a year, and the importance of that?
There's two reasons, at least two reasons. Number one is that what should be incorporated in your quarterly qualifications is discussion of your firearms discharge, shooting policy, whatever you want to call that. And as I indicated, talking to officers here in St. Louis, a non-trivial number of them could not articulate the specifics of the policy. And unfortunately, this is not unique to St. Louis. I've talked to other officers in other places where they don't get the review and they can't articulate. So when you do the quarterly quals, you can discuss the shooting policy in the context of, hey, we're gonna go fire some rounds, we're gonna do some training, whatever the case might be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that using the firearm is a perishable skill. And being able to manipulate it and being able to use it appropriately, reload, all the things that need to be done, the more you do it, the better you're going to be at it. And the better you are at it, the more confident you're going to be, and the more judicious you will be, at least theoretically, in your application of deadly force. If you are competent and confident in whatever it is that you're doing, I notice right now you're touch typing. I couldn't do that in a million years. I still hunt and pet. So you take notes great because you were trained and you do it all the time. If you stop doing that for a year, it's not just like riding a bicycle. It's going to take you a little while. You will start having more mistakes, so on and so forth. And something as important as using deadly force is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. And so if you put those two pieces together, if you're training your officers, if you're having your officers qualify quarterly, and that qualification includes a training component about the use of deadly force, what you're doing is you're marrying the physical skill of dealing with your weapon and clearing malfunctions and pulling the trigger with, oh, this is why I might use this, because I can only use it in conformance with my training and my policy.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak to other cities and how, is this, are we, do other cities, for example, do, for quarterly, as you recommended?
Many places do, many places do not. The IACP, who I cited, says that if you only do it once a year or biannually, you're out of round with the current state of affairs of what we should have. But unfortunately, there are agencies that don't do it quarterly.
So, but by national standards, we should be doing it quarterly?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. That does it for me. Thank you.
I had a few questions.
Yes, sir.
Looking at your report, I think Alderwoman, I think you touched on this one. One matter you say you did not address in your previous report is that investigations into officer-involved shootings are typically handled as part of a single investigation and also encompasses the underlying crime that led to the shooting.
Right.
So we need to get some clarification on how that's been changed. I know we do have somebody from the new Force Investigative Unit. Are you from Force Investigative Unit?
At the Circuit Attorney's Office, not at the Police Department.
At
So
the
yes.
Secretary Attorney's Office. Do you have any information about that, about how, are those handled separately from the
Yes.
crime now?
Yes. Now, the Police Department's Force Investigation Unit handles the investigation into the shooting,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever unit is appropriate will look into the underlying crime.
Okay. Have you guys received cases yet at the
Yes.
Secretary Attorney's Office?
We have done reports on the shooting death of Von Derek Myers and Kajimi Powell.
Just those two so far?
And we're in the middle of two others currently, but those are the two that we've completed.
Okay. All right. In the first report, the 2009 report too, you note that very few of the officers involved in the shootings actually suffered from any sort of injury during the incidents. And you take note to mean that does not necessarily mean that the use of deadly force wasn't justified.
Correct.
But it is worth noting, though, I think of the 153 officers. 153 officers who took citizens under fire in the years 2003 through 2007. So it's 153.
Right.
Of those, 16 officers suffered minor injuries and 3 suffered major injuries. Was that shocking to you at all, or is that in line with?
That's in line with what I understand, and if you think about it, assuming for the sake of argument that the use of deadly force was appropriate in each and every one of those cases, and I would argue that that's not a safe assumption, but let's assume for sake of argument that St. Louis officers are only using deadly force when it's appropriate. Remember, the goal is to protect life, either an innocent citizen's life or the officer's life. And if you attack me with a knife and I shoot you before you can stab me, I have done my job, I have protected myself. If you pull a gun and I shoot you before you can get rounds off, or if you shoot at me and miss, and I shoot you, I've done my job. And so officers are trained to, for lack of a better term, to preempt the injury by using deadly force, and that is why officers use deadly force, is to preempt or prevent injury to themselves or other innocents.
Let me ask you this, there's talk now about how, each bullet should be justified.
Mhm.
So not just the single overall use of force, but the use of each bullet.
Mhm.
And do you think that's a direction that the city should be moving into, that each bullet is seen as a separate use of deadly force and each has to be justified?
Yes and no, and what I mean by that is this, that you're only allowed to use deadly force when it is let's just talk about policy now, within the four corners of the St. Louis Police Department policy manual regarding the use of deadly force. And so, yes, if we look at every time a police officer pulls the trigger, he is exercising or she is exercising deadly force, yes. However, we have to understand that within what we know about human performance and the capacity of people to think. So for example, I mentioned the issue of lag time in terms of those three things about taking an individual with an edged weapon under fire, that it takes a little bit of time to, oh, I need to shoot, oh, I pulled the trigger. The same thing happens in terms of making the assessment of now it's time to stop shooting. And so, as long as the standard is a reasonable police officer, we're gonna hold you accountable to what a reasonable police officer could do. I have no problem with that. But if what people mean by each and every bullet is, oh, here's a video, this person is now collapsing, and you fired additional rounds as they are collapsing. Well, what we know about how people perceive, and I've interviewed 300 cops around the country who've been involved in shootings, in addition to the informal interviews that I conducted with the St. Louis officers that I mentioned. Perceptual anomalies, time lag, all sorts of things come into play where what the officer is perceiving is not exactly what's on the video. And what I mean by that is this, the officer will say, I stopped shooting when the suspect fell to the ground, but on the video there's 2 or 3 additional rounds fired. I say, that makes perfect sense to me because what I know about reaction time. Flip side of the coin, however, and let's take the situation in Chicago. Have you seen the Laquan McDonald shooting?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know at what point, let's assume for a moment, just assume for a moment, and this is not what I believe, let's assume for the moment that Van Dyke was justified in using the initial shot and Mr. McDonald falls to the ground. 15 seconds later? No. At some point there, this has just become ridiculous. However, if we had a situation where, and let's change it a little bit, Laquan McDonald in fact attacked the officers and Officer Van Dyke fired 2 or 3 rounds, McDonald falls to the ground, Officer Van Dyke fires 2 or 3 more rounds, that makes sense to me in terms of reaction time, because if you make a decision to start shooting, you then have to make a decision to stop shooting. But we're talking about a couple of seconds, we're not talking about a quarter of a minute. So, yes, in terms of course officers are always accountable for their use of deadly force. Each time they pull the trigger, they are exercising deadly force. But we have to judge that based upon what we know about human performance capabilities.
Okay, so on one end, you've got the Laquan McDonald shooting in Chicago.
Right.
Which I think most reasonable people would say those were too many bullets used.
And it shouldn't have even happened in the first place, but that's.
Okay, and then on the other end, we have the Kajimi Powell shooting
Right.
in St. Louis, which there's split agreement. I think you gave your opinion earlier, which I disagree with. How do you put this into a policy? How do you actually write it to come up with wording that says that one is okay and one is not okay?
When you say one is okay and one is not okay, what do you mean?
So for instance, I haven't seen a policy written or language yet that would, in the case of Laquan McDonald case, they all seem to be worded as, if you're able to shoot one shot, you're able to unload your gun.
And that's wrong.
Yeah, so is it wrong that they're written that way, or is it wrong that my interpretation is that they're
I
written that way?
think your interpretation is incorrect, and if it is written that way, it is wrong. Deadly force is only authorized, let's take the fleeing felon part out.
Mhm.
Defense of life. Deadly force is only authorized, legitimate, legal, appropriate, whatever term you choose to use, when a police officer has a reasonable perception that his or her life or the life of an innocent third party is in imminent jeopardy. If I shoot you because you have a gun and that gun falls out of your hand and I continue to shoot 2 or 3 more rounds because it takes me a little while to figure out, oh, the gun has fallen out of his hand, in my opinion, because of what I know about human performance, that's okay. Because I am still shooting to protect my life. His life, her life, whoever else is in the room. You fall down to the left, the gun is to the right, there's a separation of 5 feet. At some point here, it no longer is reasonable. No reasonable police officer could perceive body on the ground over here, gun on the ground over there, as a continuing threat. However, let's say, and once again this is on video, this hypothetical is on video, you drop this gun, but now I see you going into your waistband. Well, one of the things police officers are trained is what we call the +1 rule. If someone has one weapon, they may have a second weapon. One of the things that I pointed out in my, I think both my reports, is the issue of handcuffing suspects and why you need to do that. If you get involved in a shooting, once everything is calmed down, someone needs to approach, handcuff the suspect, search, then render first aid. But at any rate, let's say that I see you reaching into your waistband. Well, you had one gun. You're reaching into your waistband. Maybe you're reaching into your waistband to pull a gun, or maybe what you're doing is you're just putting your hand on top of your belly where I just shot you. I don't know, but a reasonable officer could perceive, in my opinion, that you are now going for a second gun, right? So it's always within the context of what is going on. And so if I can fire one round, that doesn't mean I get to fire 16, any more than if I have an assault rifle with a 30-round clip, that I can fire 30 rounds just because I could fire one round. Once that threat is over, deadly force is no longer appropriate.
So in the case of the Kijimi Powell shooting,
Right.
We know that he was, even if they didn't know about his mental illness or his mental state, the weapon they saw was a smaller blade weapon.
Right.
They were in an SUV,
Right.
and each of them, not just one, both shot 6 times.
Right.
Is that necessary? Is that beyond? When you're talking about blade versus guns, there's a choice: 1, to get back in the vehicle, and 2, would not 1 bullet or 2 bullets or 6 bullets from one officer be enough?
In terms of getting back in the vehicle, to protect the officer and to prevent a shooting, sure, they could have just hopped in the vehicle and backed up. But remember, there's innocent citizens here, and they don't know what this gentleman's gonna be doing with the knife. And so to me, they would be derelict in their duty to get back in their vehicle and to extricate themselves. In terms of the number of rounds fired, we have to now go back to the third issue, which is terminal ballistics. And what we know is that 1 bullet, 2 bullet, 3 bullet sometimes isn't gonna stop anybody. And so police officers are trained appropriately to fire until the threat is over with. And if we look at the video, there are a second or 2 or however many seconds between the time that he collapses to the ground and the gunfire ceases. But in my mind, firing 6 rounds, just because it's 6 rounds is not excessive. I interviewed a police officer out in California who was involved in a big shootout. He was a member of a SWAT team, and he and a number of other officers took a suspect under fire who had already shot 2 members of the SWAT team, and he was hit 41 times. The suspect was hit 41 times. The only rounds that actually led the suspect to collapse and then finally die were the rounds that were fired by the officer I interviewed, who happened to be firing a rifle. The other officers were firing submachine guns that had pistol caliber rounds. And so the suspect survived 30-plus handgun caliber rounds. I have a good friend who was shot literally through the heart, police officer, who after being shot through the heart, chased the guy down and killed him. He was in the process of still trying to shoot at her. And so the practicalities of criminal ballistics tell us that, and police officers should be trained about this stuff, tell us that sometimes it takes what the layperson might view as an excessive number of rounds to stop the threat.
Okay. On a separate note here, I was looking for a chart in here, but of the 150, this is again from your first report.
Yes, sir.
Was looked at the period between 2003 and 2007. There were 153 officers who used deadly force. You note the demographics of the officers. 100 of the officers were white, 52 of the officers were black, and 1 was Asian.
Right.
Did you find that white officers fired more often than black officers?
No, it's about the same, and one of the things that we note in this latest report is that about 2/3 of St. Louis Police Department sworn personnel during the 10 years, 03 to 2012, were white. About 1/3 were black, and about, so 2/3 and 1/3, and that's about what you have right there, sir. So you have the basic same demographics of the agency and officers shooting. So it's about 2/3 to 1/3, and about 2/3 of the shooters are white and about 1/3 are black.
You also have a chart here of the age of the officers involved.
What page are you on, sir?
This is page 17 of the 2009 report,
Okay.
table 5. It had the ages of the 153 officers. 15 or 10% were 25 years old or
Mhm.
under. 33 or 22% was between 23 and 30.
Right.
Did you find that younger officers fired more often?
Do you mean they're more likely to be involved in a shooting or fire more rounds?
Well, let's take those separately.
Okay.
So, are younger officers more likely to be involved in a shooting?
Yes. And in all likelihood, that is because younger officers tend to be involved more in patrol work, and that's where most shootings occur than other types of assignments. Regarding your second question, I don't know about the age of the officer and the number of rounds fired. Theoretically, I should be able to access that information. So if you want me to, I can do that, and we can bring that up next week. I think I should be able to do it by next week. I'm just thinking out loud here. But
Well, I tell you what, before you start working on that,
Okay.
what I will ask the committee members to do is if there are any questions that you want Professor or Dr. Klinger to look at, maybe submit those in writing, and
Mhm.
I'll submit them to him. And then maybe we can shoot to have you back in a week or so, next week. When do we go down?
A week on Friday.
17th, yeah.
A week from Friday. So maybe we'll do, if you're available next week, perhaps we can schedule.
I teach Mondays and Wednesdays, so either in the afternoons, my second class is done at 12:15, so I'd be available after 1. Typically, I had someone guest lecture for me today, or Tuesday, Thursday. So afternoons, Monday, Wednesday, or anytime Tuesday, Thursday.
We'll work
next
around
week.
your schedule.
Okay.
I prepared a list of recommendations that I heard from today's meeting.
Right.
So perhaps we can have a review of that, and then, as mentioned, maybe just a review. I would like to have a review of the current use of force policy as it compares nationally.
Okay.
So, but as far as specific questions, I think that, for me, they would come out of that review of the current use of force policy. Dr. Klinger's recommendations on it.
Okay, so the questions that you've prepared are the recommendations. Is this something for us to review and then ask SLPS about, St. Louis?
I mean, I
Police
think so,
Department about?
I would think so. I mean, these have
Let's
come
do those.
directly from our conversation today and, from these documents, and then we've discussed them here today. And
Okay.
maybe this would then also add, you could, you know, add to it, and this is something for us to maybe review internally, if we want Dr. Klinger's take on it, or something like that next week.
Okay, and would the committee also like to, based on some of the testimony of Dr. Klinger, have Chief Dotson back to ask him some more specific questions about the policy? And how it was addressed in these things? I would also like to ask him, because he did tell us that a current study was being done, so I would like to get some clarification on that.
I would think that we would want to have Dr. Klinger come back and do an investigation into the use of force policy. And then after that, following that, once we've maybe had an internal dialogue regarding this meeting and the follow-up meeting with Dr. Klinger, then invite Chief Dotson to come and address some of these things that maybe have been addressed since some of this, since these publications. And then the recommendations that we may formally put forth, but a discussion with Chief Dotson before we do that, in case some of those things are being done or worked on now. And then formalize the subcommittee's recommendations.
Okay, and in between this meeting and the next time we meet with you, any questions that we have regarding whether the current use of force policy took into consideration any of your previous recommendations, we can probably, you can take a look at the current use of force policies that are on our website, and we can also review those too, individually.
It's on the police website, the police department's website as well, is that not? Or is it not help?
Yeah, he did not, no, ours is, yeah.
Nobody asked me to,
No, sure, no, I just mean, it should be,
Now, we talked about that at our first meeting,
Supposed to
about
be.
would
yeah.
he be making those public, and he said that he would be figuring it out, but it is not public.
Okay.
At this point, our
forgot
website is
that.
the only source to get all of the policies of the police department related to use of force.
I understand, and I forgot that little.
and someone's gonna send me an email with a link, is that correct?
Yep.
Perfect.
Yeah. Now, if there are no other questions,
No, thank you, this is great. I mean,
Thank you,
it's
yeah.
especially nice to hear the
Interesting.
perspective of somebody who has served as an officer, and has that perspective too. So, I mean, we're really grateful for your time.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for making time and coming today.
I-
Meeting adjourned.